On this day in history, May 20th, 325, the First Council of Nicaea is formally opened, starting the first ecumenical council of the Christian Church. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the council. The Council of Nicaea, 325 AD, is an event of the highest importance in the history of Christianity. Its convocation by Constantine and its course illustrate the radical revolution which the position of this religion within the confines of the Roman Empire had undergone in consequence of the Edict of Milan. From his ascension, Constantine had shown himself the friend of the Christians, and when his victory over Licinius, 323 AD, gave him undisputed possession of the crown, he adhered to this religious policy, distinguishing and fortifying the Christian cause by gratuities and grants of privileges. This propitiatory attitude originated in the fact that he recognized Christianity, which had successfully braved so many persecutions, as the most vital and vigorous of religions, and as the power of the future. Consequently, he directed his energies toward the establishment of a positive relationship between it and the Roman state. But the Church could only maintain its great value for the politician by remaining the same compact organism which it had proved itself to be under the stormy reign of Diocletian. Scarcely, however, did it find itself in the enjoyment of peaceful relations with the state, when violent feuds broke out in its midst, whose extent and the virulence with which they were waged threatened to dismember the whole religious body. Donatism in the West was followed by the Arian struggle in the East. The former movement had been successfully arrested, though it survived in North Africa till the 5th century. The conflict kindled by the Alexandrian presbyter Arius with regard to the relation of Christ to God assumed a more formidable character. Constantine, therefore, had recourse to an institution previously evolved by the Christian Church, the convocation of a synod to pronounce on burning questions, enlarging it, however, to correspond with the altered circumstances. He convened a council designed to represent the whole Church of the Empire at Nicaea in Bithynia, a town situated no great way from the imperial summer residence of Nicaea, and within easy reach by sea of the Oriental bishops. In consequence of the vast distances, the West was not largely represented, but the able theologian Hosius, Bishop of Cordova, was present. The three most important bishoprics of the East were represented: Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem. A prominent part was also taken by Eusebius, Bishop of Nicomedia, and his namesake of Caesarea, the historian, along with a very large number of others from the East. Among the attendant clergy, the still youthful deacon Athanasius, destined to succeed Alexander in the See of Alexandria, was prominent as the most powerful antagonist of Arianism. The synod sat from May 20th to July 25th. The deliberations on the Arian question passed through several distinct stages before the final condemnation of Arius and his doctrines was reached. A clearly defined standpoint was repealed to this. With regard to this problem, the relationship of Christ to God was held only by the comparatively small group of Arians, and a not much larger group who adhered with unshaken conviction to the Alexandrian view. The bulk of the members occupied a position between these two extremes. They rejected the formula of Arius, and declined to accept those of his opponents. That is to say, they were merely competent to establish negotiations, but lacked the capacity as yet to give their attitude of compromise a positive expression. That the majority of the council should have adopted this neutral tendency is easily intelligible when we consider the state of theology at that period. True, at Nicaea, this majority eventually acquiesced in the ruling of the Alexandrians, yet this result was due, not to internal conviction, but partly to indifference, partly to the pressure of the imperial will, a fact which is mainly demonstrated by the subsequent history of the Arian conflicts. For if the Nicene Synod had arrived at its final decision by the consensus agreement of all non-Arians, then the confession of faith there formulated might indeed have evoked this continued antagonism of the Arians, but must necessarily have been championed by all else. This, however, was not the case. In fact, the creed was assailed by those very bodies which had posed the laissez-faire center at Nicaea, and we are compelled to the conclusion that, in this point, the voting was no criterion of the inward convictions of the council. In the synod, an Arian confession of faith was first brought forward and read, but it aroused such a storm of indignation that obviously, in the interests of a restoration of ecclesiastical peace, there could be no question of its acceptance. On this, Eusebius of Caesarea submitted the baptismal creed of his community. Since the creed dated from a period anterior to the outbreak of the Arian struggle, its reception would have been equivalent to a declaration on the part of the council that it declined to define its position with reference to the controversy of the hour. That the greater number of delegates were not disinclined to adopt this subterfuge, and to shelve the actual solution of the whole problems by recognition of this or some similar neutral formula, is extremely probable. But the emperor saw that, if the difficulties were eluded in any such way, it was inevitable from the very nature of the case that they should rise again in an accentuated form, and that consequently no pacification could be expected from this policy. Accordingly, Constantine proposed that the Caesarean Creed should be modified by the insertion of the Alexandrian passwords, including the decisive term identical in nature, as if for the purpose of more accurate definition, and by the deletion of certain portions. That he appreciated the import of these alterations, or realized that this revision was virtually the proclamation of a new doctrine, is scarcely probable. The creed thus evolved by an artificial unity with no ratification of peace. In fact, it paved the way for a struggle which convulsed the whole empire. For it was the proclamation of the Nicene Creed that first opened the eyes of many bishops to the significance of the problem there treated, and its explanation led the Church to force herself, by an arduous path of theological work, into compliance with those principles enunciated at Nicaea, to which in the year 325 she had pledged herself without genuine assent.